Drummers generally hit 4 different types of head material on a regular basis. Mostly we play Mylar heads on acoustic drums, but with the increase in electronics we are also very likely to play mesh heads and other surfaces like rubber and Yamaha's TCS or textured cellular silicon. What all electronic drum pads are actually trying to copy, with different degrees of success, is the feel of a Mylar drumhead. That is the standard by which all other head surfaces are compared to, because it is the real deal. Mylar is DuPont's brand name for polyester film, which was first tried by a 3M engineer called Jim Irwin as a drum head material in the early 1950s. This was later taken up by Remo Belli, who started Remo, and Chick Evans, who started Evans, to make drumheads from the 1950s onwards. And Mylar is what makes up almost 100% of acoustic drumheads today. However, since the 1990s and because of electronic drum kits, mesh has become very popular, and now almost all electronic drum kits have a mesh head option. However, despite what many people think, mesh is not new. The earliest patent I can find for a woven mesh style drumhead is from the mid-1850s, but we now associate them with electronic drum kits. When mesh drumheads first came out, drummers leapt on them as being the perfect electronic drumhead, and they sort of were, because they were pretty quiet, they were tunable, and they were bouncy. But due to clever marketing, we were also led to believe that the mesh head felt exactly the same as a Mylar drumhead, which of course now we know it doesn't. A lot of why we all assumed that mesh heads were so realistic comes mainly from the fact that you can tension them with the drum key. However, there are 2 points of note about this. As firstly, mesh heads have a pretty limited tension range to get a decent trigger from. And secondly, drummers don't realise that mesh heads really rebound in a very different way to a normal Mylar head. In other words, when you loosen a Mylar head, it loses its bounce. But with a mesh head, loosening it can actually increase the bounce, depending on the head makeup. This is all how down to mesh heads are constructed, but more of this later on. So I thought I'd do a video on the different head surfaces, Mylar, mesh, rubber and TCS, and why they feel the way they do, what each one is good for, and how each one can help you. Mylar is a tough film that doesn't really stretch very much. When we hit it, it deforms from the bearing edge to the impact point. And one important thing is that Mylar doesn't let air through. So when you hit a Mylar head, the air is trapped inside the drum. A small amount of air can get out through the air hole, but not generally enough to let the air pressure equalise inside and outside the drum. So when you hit a double-headed drum with Mylar heads on, you're really hitting a container of air. The air inside the drum pushes back against the stick hit, and that is a large part of what pushes the stick back. The other factor is, of course, the tension of the top head. If you take the bottom head off the drum, then all the air can escape, and you don't get all the air pressure pushing the stick back. This is why it is easy to play fast and hard on a double-headed drum, but much more difficult to play exactly the same thing on a single-headed drum. There's just nothing pushing the stick back. When electronic drums really hit the big time with Simmons in the 1980s, the original head surfaces were Riot Shield plastic or polycarbonate, which had a great bounce, it's like playing on a desk, if you don't play hard. But as they have no give, caused Simmons elbow when you started to hit them hard, as we all do when we start enjoying ourselves. The second head material used by Simmons was rubber, which was glued to a plywood surface, and eventually sprung rubber surfaces were used, which were much more comfortable to play on. The Scandinavians took a different approach, and eDrum used real Mylar heads on their high-end electronic drums. But as making Mylar-headed electronic drum pads was expensive, all the new Japanese companies coming onto the market used rubber for their head surfaces, as it is cheap, very tough, reliable, and has a couple of other features that we'll mention about in a second. Rubber is a pretty dense material, so when you do hit it with a stick, it just deforms where it's been hit, and the energy stored in the rubber is what pushes the stick back. In terms of realism, it's not very close, but for a lot of users, that doesn't really matter. It's just something to hit. Rubber later had a bad press, as yet again marketing to try and get us all to buy more expensive pads led us to believe that rubber is in fact a bit rubbish. However, rubber has one massive advantage over mesh, Mylar and TCS. it is incredibly fast to trigger. So the lowly cheap pad is way faster than the others. Because of its density and the fact that most rubber surfaces sit on a metal plate called the reflection plate, which collects the vibration and passes it onto the piezo pickup, the time from when you hit the rubber pad to when the piezo sends its trigger signal to the module is very, very fast. That's why you'll see rubber pads on the kits of drummers who you associate with very precise playing and triggering, drummers like Andy Gangadine and Tom Meadows. Plus, there are some great feeling rubber pads out there. You just have to know what to look for. Drummers first became aware of mesh with the TD10 in the late 90s. Even though the story goes that one of the designers got the idea from seeing a trampoline in a garden centre, woven or mesh heads, as I said at the start, are nothing new and have been around for over 150 years. And the Pollard Syndrome had a woven mesh style head way back in the 1970s. Mesh heads have two sets of threads running in different directions to each other, woven like cloth, over and under each consecutive thread. This is for each ply or layer of a mesh head, so a 2-ply mesh head will have 4 sets of threads in total. The idea of a mesh head is great, but it doesn't react in the same way as Mylar, which is what we're all trying to copy anyway, for a few very obvious reasons. Firstly, because mesh is woven, it has lots, thousands of holes in it. So unlike Mylar, it can't trap the air inside the drum. So there's no air pushing against the underside of the head as we play to push the stick back. Therefore, only the tension of the mesh head is what pushes the stick back. And as we have seen, mesh heads don't really behave like Mylar under tension. Secondly, due to the construction of most mesh heads, the energy is trapped and dissipates inside the mesh in a totally different way to Mylar. As Mylar is a film, it acts like a single piece of material, deforming where it has been hit. But as mesh is made up of strands of Mylar or nylon, depending on the manufacturer, it acts like hundreds of separate pieces of material, only largely deforming where there is definite pressure, which is why you get more of an inverted volcano when you press down on a mesh head. So when a mesh head is at a low tension, all the separate strands can roll and slide over and against each other, and all stretch separately because they aren't being held in place. They are not a film. So a stick hit on a loose mesh head has the tension from hundreds of strands acting on it. And because they all bend towards the hit point, it is very focused and very bouncy. The tighter the mesh is, the more friction there is between the individual strands, and they start to get more like a single piece of material. But they never get to the stage where they are a single piece of material. That is why mesh still feels bouncy when it is loose, and often feels much less bouncy when it's tight. It's all to do with the amount of internal friction. Then finally, we come to TCS, or textured cellular silicon. This was developed years ago by Yamaha to be a better electronic drumhead material, but I'm not here to say it's the best, as let's face it, nothing will feel like Mylar apart from Mylar, but TCS does have a couple of big advantages. TCS, textured cellular silicon, as its name suggests, is a silicon surface. When the silicon is poured into the mould, air is blown through it, so there are thousands of very, very fine air bubbles trapped within the silicon. Then another very strong but soft surface layer is bonded to the top of the silicon to protect it, and that is the completed head material. So what happens when you hit the TCS head is that the surface deforms to the impact point, just like a mesh head, but the air bubbles trapped inside the surface capture the energy of the stick and push the stick back up, just like the air underneath a Mylar head. So TCS feels closer to Mylar because of the trapped air. Plus it is quieter than mesh, and it also doesn't wear out unless it is physically damaged. So what I'm saying here is that there's a lot of misunderstanding about different head materials. It's not an open and shut case, and a lot of it depends on what you want from the drum head. For example, I see online that many drummers are saying that 3-ply mesh heads are the most realistic, but that's not the conclusion that I've come to, but don't take my word for it. To be more realistic, In other words, to be as close to Mylar as possible, any mesh head that we use has got to act as close to a single piece of material as possible and retain as much air as possible. The more plies in a mesh head, the better the feel, but the worse the triggering, as the more plies make it more rigid and it is difficult for the vibrations to pass through it. If you are a heavy hitter though, then a 3-ply head is going to be great for you. The less plies the mesh head has, the less realistic the feel, but the better the triggering, as the vibrations pass through it more easily. So if you want to use mesh and you want it to feel good and you want it to trigger really well, don't buy 3-ply mesh heads, but look for a thick single-ply mesh. There are some really good versions of this head, made up from thick wide strips of nylon material which can't roll over each other like cheaper mesh heads can. They feel really good, they trigger really well, and I've had a better reaction to these sort of heads on my teaching kit than any other mesh heads I've used over the years. The trade-off is that they are louder than a normal mesh head, which may not be what you want or need. So there you have it. Nothing feels like Mylar, but there are options and you can get fairly close. Don't write off rubber though, nothing triggers as fast as rubber, although the feel is probably the least realistic. As I'm always saying when it comes to electronic drums, there is always a compromise. For realism, go Mylar, but it is very noisy. For natural feel, go for TCS. For sensitive, quiet, dynamic mesh, go thin single ply, but it won't feel very realistic. For realistic feeling mesh with great triggering, go for thick single ply. For good feeling mesh suitable for harder players, go 3-ply. For fastest triggering, go for rubber.